Aurora Chun stepped through the towering glass doors of Lincoln Valley High School, her messenger bag slung across her shoulder and a carefully packed lunch container clutched in her left hand. At 16, she possessed an almost ethereal quality. That made her seem to glide rather than walk, her movements precise and deliberate in a way that most teenagers hadn't yet mastered. Her long black hair was braided down her back in a complex pattern she'd learned from her grandmother, and her dark eyes held a depth that suggested she'd seen more of the world than most of her peers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sprawling campus of Lincoln Valley High stretched before her like a small city, complete with multiple academic buildings, athletic facilities, and outdoor courtyards where students gathered in their various social clusters. With nearly 3,000 students, it was the kind of place where someone could easily disappear into the crowd, which was exactly what Aurora had been hoping for when her family moved here from Portland 3 weeks ago. The move hadn't been by choice. Her father, a software engineer, had been offered a position at a major tech company that he couldn't refuse, especially after her mother's freelance graphic design business had struggled during the economic downturn. Aurora understood the practical reasons behind the relocation, but that didn't make leaving behind her friends, her favorite hiking trails, and the small dojo where she'd been training for the past 8 years any easier. What none of her knew, classmates could possibly know, was that Aurora Chun wasn't just another transfer student trying to fit in. Hidden beneath her quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance was someone who had been studying ninjutsu since she was 8 years old, following a traditional training regimen that emphasized not just physical techniques but mental discipline, spiritual balance, and the ancient philosophy of remaining invisible while being completely aware of one's surroundings. Her sensei, Master Yamamoto, had been a third-generation practitioner who'd immigrated to America in the 1960s and established a small, private dojo that focused on authentic ninja arts rather than the flashy martial arts performances that most people associated with ninjas from movies and television. Aurora had been one of only 12 students accepted into his rigorous program, and over the years she'd mastered skills that ranged from silent movement and concealment to pressure point manipulation and psychological warfare. The training had been comprehensive and demanding. She could scale walls without making a sound, disable opponents twice her size using techniques that targeted nerve clusters, and most importantly, she'd learned to read people's intentions through micro-expressions and body language with an accuracy that was almost supernatural. Master Yamamoto had always emphasized that the greatest ninja were those who never had to fight because they could anticipate and avoid conflicts before they escalated. But Lincoln Valley High School presented challenges that her 8 years of training hadn't quite prepared her for. The social dynamics of American teenagers operated according to rules that were both more complex and more arbitrary than anything she'd encountered in her martial arts studies. There were invisible hierarchies based on everything from clothing brands to family income, unspoken codes about who could sit where during lunch, and a constant undercurrent of competition that seemed to have nothing to do with actual accomplishments. Aurora had spent her first 2 weeks observing, cataloging the various social groups and their territories within the school's ecosystem. There were the athletes who dominated the central courtyard during lunch periods, the theater kids who claimed the area near the auditorium, the academic overachievers who gathered in the library, and dozens of smaller cliques that had formed around shared interests or social status. What troubled her most wasn't the existence of these groups, but the way certain students seemed to derive pleasure from making others miserable. She'd witnessed countless incidents of what could only be described as casual cruelty: books knocked from hands, deliberately spilled drinks, whispered insults designed to be overheard by their targets, and a systematic exclusion of anyone who didn't conform to narrow definitions of acceptability. The cafeteria was where these dynamics played out most dramatically. Aurora had quickly learned to navigate the complex geography of lunch tables, understanding that sitting in the wrong place could mark someone as a target for harassment. She'd found a small table near the windows where she could eat her carefully, prepared vegan meals while observing the social theater that unfolded around her. Her commitment to veganism had begun 3 years earlier, initially motivated by environmental concerns, but gradually evolving into a deeper philosophical stance about minimizing harm to all living beings. This aligned perfectly with the ninja principle of taking only what was necessary and leaving no unnecessary trace of one's presence. She'd learned to prepare elaborate plant-based meals that were both nutritionally complete and satisfying, often bringing colorful salads, homemade energy balls, and fresh fruit arrangements that drew curious glances from classmates accustomed to processed foods from the school's vending machines. The attention her lunches attracted wasn't always positive. Several students had made comments about her weird hippie food, and she'd overheard whispered conversations about whether she was some kind of health freak or just trying to be different for attention. Aurora had chosen to ignore these comments, understanding that people often mocked what they didn't understand, but she'd also begun to notice patterns in who made these remarks and when. The most persistent source of negativity came from a group of 4 students who seemed to have appointed themselves as unofficial enforcers of social conformity. Their leader was Brittany Summers, a tall blonde junior whose father owned a chain of successful car dealerships throughout the region. Brittany possessed the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for her actions, and she seemed to view anyone who deviated from her narrow definition of normal as a personal affront to her authority. Flanking Brittany were her closest allies, Stephanie Morrison, whose perfectly styled red hair and designer clothes marked her as someone from serious money. Derek Patterson, a senior who played varsity football and used his athletic status to intimidate anyone who challenged the group's behavior. And Ashley Rodriguez, whose nervous energy and eager-to-please attitude suggested she participated. The group's activities more from fear of exclusion than genuine malice. Aurora had been studying this group with the same methodical attention her sensei had taught her to apply to potential opponents. She'd noted Brittany's tendency to attack when she had an audience, Stephanie's preference for psychological rather than physical aggression, Derek's reliance on his size and reputation to avoid actual confrontations, and Ashley's visible discomfort. During the group's more cruel moments, for 3 weeks, Aurora had managed to avoid direct confrontation with them by employing classic ninja tactics. She varied her routes through the school, timed her movements to avoid predictable patterns, and maintained what Master Yamamoto called soft focus. Awareness, a state of heightened perception that allowed her to sense potential threats before they materialized, but maintaining invisibility was becoming increasingly difficult as her unique lunch choices continued to draw attention. Students had begun pointing out her elaborate vegan meals to friends, and she'd noticed several people taking photos of her food arrangements, presumably to share on social media with mocking captions about the weird new girl who brought Instagram-worthy salads to school. The breaking point had been building for days. Aurora could sense the shift in energy around Brittany's group, the way their conversations would pause when she passed their table, the increasingly bold stares they directed at her during lunch periods. Her ninja training had taught her to recognize the signs of an impending attack, the subtle changes in posture, the way predators position themselves relative to their intended victim, and most importantly, the gradual escalation of provocative behavior designed to test their target's responses. Yesterday, Derek had accidentally bumped into her table while walking past, causing her carefully arranged lunch to slide across the surface. When she'd looked up at him, he'd offered an obviously insincere apology before rejoining his friends, who were barely containing their laughter. The incident had been minor, easily dismissed as genuine clumsiness, but Aurora's trained instincts recognized it as a test to see how she would respond to provocation. She'd chosen not to respond at all, simply reorganizing her lunch and continuing to eat as if nothing had happened. But she'd also begun preparing mentally for what she suspected was coming. Master Yamamoto had always taught that the best way to handle bullies was to avoid giving them what they wanted, which was usually a reaction that would justify escalating their behavior. However, he'd also emphasized that there came a point where strategic action became necessary to prevent further aggression. This morning, as Aurora prepared her lunch with extra care, she'd included items that she suspected might trigger a more direct confrontation. Her salad was particularly elaborate, mixed greens arranged in a mandala pattern, cherry tomatoes and cucumber slices placed with geometric precision, homemade tahini dressing in a small glass container, and toasted pumpkin seeds sprinkled artfully across the top. She'd also packed fresh berries, raw almonds, and a thermos of green tea that her grandmother had shipped from their family's favorite shop in San Francisco. The presentation was admittedly striking, something that belonged in a high-end restaurant rather than a high school cafeteria. Aurora knew this would attract attention, and her ninja training had taught her that sometimes the best way to end a conflict was to bring it to a head under circumstances of your own choosing, rather than allowing it to escalate gradually. As she made her way through the cafeteria toward her usual table, Aurora could feel the familiar weight of observation from multiple directions. Her peripheral vision caught the way conversations paused as she passed, the not-so-subtle pointing from various tables, and most importantly, the intense focus from Brittany's group, who were clearly preparing for some kind of action. Aurora set her lunch container on the table and began unpacking her meal with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. She was aware of every movement around her, could sense the shift in energy as several students began positioning themselves to get better views of whatever was about to happen, and noticed the way Brittany's group had fallen unusually quiet. While maintaining their focused attention on her table, the salad, when fully arranged, was indeed impressive. The colors were vibrant and perfectly balanced, the textures varied and appealing, and the overall presentation demonstrated both artistic sensibility and nutritional knowledge. Aurora had learned to take pride in creating beautiful, healthful meals, viewing it as another form of the mindful practice that permeated every aspect of her ninja training. She'd taken perhaps 3 bites when she became aware of movement in her peripheral vision. Brittany was approaching her table, flanked by Stephanie and Derek, while Ashley hung back slightly, her body language suggesting reluctance to participate in whatever was planned. Aurora continued eating, but shifted her awareness to what Master Yamamoto called combat readiness without aggression, a state where every muscle was prepared for action while maintaining an appearance of complete relaxation. Well, Brittany announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Look what the health food freak brought for lunch today." She gestured dramatically at Aurora's carefully arranged salad, her voice dripping with theatrical disdain. "Is this supposed to be food, or are you planning to enter it in some kind of art contest?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Aurora looked up calmly, meeting Brittany's gaze with the steady focus she'd learned during countless hours of meditation. She could read the aggression in the girl's posture, could see the way Derek was positioning himself to block potential escape routes, and noticed how Stephanie was holding her phone in a way that suggested she was recording the interaction. "It's lunch," Aurora replied simply, her voice carrying none of the defensiveness that Brittany was clearly hoping to provoke. "I prefer to eat foods that align with my values." Stephanie laughed sharply. "Your values? What, like thinking you're better than everyone else because you eat rabbit food?" She gestured dismissively at the salad. "We get it, you're special and different, but this is just pretentious." Aurora could sense the attention of the surrounding tables focusing on their interaction, could feel the anticipation building as other students recognized the signs of an impending confrontation. She took another bite of her salad, chewing thoughtfully before responding. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she said quietly. "I just make different choices about what I put in my body. Everyone's entitled to their own decisions about food." Derek stepped closer, his bulky frame clearly intended to be intimidating. "Yeah, well, your weird food choices are making other people uncomfortable. Maybe you should try eating normal food like everyone else." The suggestion was absurd on multiple levels, but Aurora recognized it as a classic bullying tactic, creating arbitrary rules that justified harassment while framing the victim as the problem. Her ninja training had included extensive study of psychological manipulation techniques, both for understanding how to resist them and, when necessary, how to employ them strategically. "I'm not sure how my eating habits could make other people uncomfortable," Aurora observed, maintaining her calm tone while her awareness expanded to catalog every potential threat and escape route in the immediate area. "I'm sitting by myself, eating quietly, not bothering anyone." Brittany's eyes flashed with irritation at Aurora's refusal to become defensive or emotional. "You're bothering us by acting like you're so much more enlightened than everyone else, with your Instagram-perfect meals and your holier-than-thou attitude." Aurora set down her fork and looked directly at Brittany, allowing a hint of the intensity she'd developed through years of combat training to show in her eyes. "I haven't said anything about anyone else's food choices or claimed to be enlightened. I've been sitting here eating lunch and minding my own business. If my meal choices bother you, perhaps you should consider why that is." The response clearly wasn't what Brittany had expected. She'd obviously been counting on Aurora to either cower or become argumentative, either of which would have justified escalating the confrontation. Instead, Aurora had remained calm while subtly shifting the focus back to Brittany's own behavior and motivations. Stephanie, sensing that their leader needed support, stepped forward with her phone now clearly recording. "Look, freak, nobody wants to watch you perform your little healthy eating show every day. It's weird and attention-seeking, and frankly, it's gross." Aurora glanced at the phone, then back at Stephanie's face. "You're recording this interaction without my consent," she observed. "Are you planning to post it somewhere, or is this for your personal collection of videos showing you harassing other students?" The directness of the question caught Stephanie off guard, and she instinctively lowered the phone slightly. Aurora had learned from Master Yamamoto that bullies often relied on their victims being too intimidated or confused to call out their behavior directly, and that simple, factual observations could disrupt their psychological momentum. Derek, apparently deciding that the situation needed to be resolved through physical intimidation, reached across the table toward Aurora's lunch container. "Maybe if your precious salad accidentally got mixed up with some real food, you'd learn to eat like a normal person." Aurora's hand moved faster than Derek's brain could process, intercepting his wrist in a grip that appeared gentle but applied pressure to specific nerve points that Master Yamamoto had taught her during their lessons on nonviolent restraint techniques. Derek's hand immediately went numb, and he found himself unable to complete his intended action. "I'd prefer if you didn't touch my food," Aurora said pleasantly, as if she were making conversation about the weather rather than demonstrating a martial arts technique that could easily escalate to more painful applications. "Personal property boundaries are important, don't you think?" Derek tried to pull his hand back and discovered that Aurora's grip, while not painful, was absolutely immovable. His eyes widened as he realized that this quiet girl possessed strength and control that his athletic training hadn't prepared him to handle. "Let go of me," he demanded, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. "Of course," Aurora replied, releasing his wrist immediately. Derek stumbled backward, flexing his fingers as sensation returned to his hand, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. The brief physical interaction had shifted the dynamic of the confrontation in ways that all four participants could feel, but none of them fully understood. Aurora had demonstrated capability without aggression, had protected her boundaries without attacking, and had done so with such calm confidence that it left her would-be harassers uncertain about how to proceed. Brittany, recognizing that the situation was not developing according to her expectations, decided to escalate more dramatically. She gestured to Ashley, who reluctantly stepped forward, carrying a large cup of milk from the school's beverage dispensers. "Since you're so committed to your special diet," Brittany announced loudly, ensuring that her words would carry to the growing audience of students who had turned to watch the drama unfold. "Maybe we should help you understand what you're missing." Aurora looked at the cup of milk, then at Ashley's obviously uncomfortable expression, then back at Brittany's face. She could read the intention in their body language, could anticipate exactly what they were planning, and could calculate a dozen different ways to prevent it from happening. Instead, she simply returned to eating her salad, taking another bite, and chewing thoughtfully while maintaining an expression of mild interest, as if she were watching strangers perform a moderately entertaining street performance, rather than being the target of their planned humiliation. The response was so unexpected that it actually caused Brittany to hesitate. She'd been counting on fear, anger, or desperate pleading, any of which would have justified the dramatic gesture she had planned. Aurora's complete lack of apparent concern disrupted the psychological momentum that bullying required to be effective. "Aren't you going to try to stop us?" Stephanie demanded, clearly frustrated by Aurora's refusal to play her assigned role in their drama. Aurora looked up from her salad and smiled slightly, an expression that held depths that none of them could quite interpret. "Why would I try? To stop you from making choices that will define who you are as people. Everyone in this cafeteria is about to learn something important about your character. I'm actually curious to see what you decide to do." The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Ashley visibly uncomfortable and caused Derek to glance around at the watching students with sudden awareness of how this interaction was being perceived by their peers. But Brittany, committed to her course of action and unwilling to back down in front of an audience, snatched the milk from Ashley's reluctant hands and raised it above Aurora's carefully arranged salad. The white liquid poured down in what seemed like slow motion, each droplet visible to Aurora's heightened senses as her years of training automatically kicked in. Her mind processed multiple scenarios simultaneously. She could catch Brittany's wrist and redirect the milk harmlessly away. She could shift her lunch tray to safety while simultaneously using the movement to unbalance her attacker, or she could employ any number of defensive techniques that would leave Brittany on the cafeteria floor, wondering what had just happened. Instead, Aurora remained perfectly still and watched as the entire contents of the cup splashed across her meticulously prepared salad, turning her artistic arrangement of vegetables into a soggy, white-drenched mess. The milk pooled around the edges of her lunch container, dripped onto the table, and soaked into the paper napkins she'd carefully arranged beside her meal. The cafeteria fell into complete silence. Students at nearby tables had stopped eating. Conversations had ceased mid-sentence, and even the lunch staff behind the serving counter had paused their activities to stare at the scene unfolding before them. The only sound was the soft dripping of milk as it continued to fall from the edge of Aurora's table onto the floor below. Brittany stood frozen with the empty cup still in her hand, clearly expecting screaming, tears, or angry retaliation. Her three companions looked equally uncertain, having anticipated a very different response to their calculated act of humiliation. The watching students seemed to be holding their collective breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented violation would be addressed. Aurora calmly reached for one of her dry napkins and began cleaning milk from her hands with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Her movements were unhurried and deliberate, as if she were performing a tea ceremony rather than dealing with the aftermath of deliberate cruelty. She examined her ruined lunch with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment, showing no sign of distress or anger. "Interesting choice," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet cafeteria. She looked up at Brittany with an expression of genuine curiosity rather than anger or hurt. "I'm wondering what you hope to accomplish with this demonstration." Brittany's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to formulate a response. She'd clearly expected Aurora to break down or lash out, either of which would have justified her actions and provided the entertainment value she'd been seeking. Aurora's calm analysis of the situation left her without a script to follow. We were teaching you a lesson about fitting in," Stephanie interjected, trying to support her leader while her phone continued recording. "Maybe now you'll think twice about bringing your weird hippie food and acting all superior." Aurora nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this explanation seriously. "I see. So your teaching method involves destroying other people's property and violating their personal boundaries. That's certainly an interesting pedagogical approach." She gestured to her milk-soaked lunch. "What specifically am I supposed to learn from this experience?" The question was delivered with such sincere curiosity that it left Brittany's group scrambling for justification. They'd expected hurt and humiliation, not Socratic dialogue about their motivations and methods. Derek, uncomfortable with the philosophical direction the conversation had taken, stepped forward aggressively. "Look, you little freak, you got exactly what you deserved. Maybe now you'll stop acting like you're better than everyone else." Aurora stood slowly, her movement so fluid and controlled that it seemed choreographed. As she rose to her full height, something in her presence shifted. The quiet girl who'd been eating lunch alone suddenly radiated an intensity that made Derek instinctively take a step backward, though he probably couldn't have explained why. "Derek Patterson," Aurora said, and her use of his full name somehow carried more weight than if she'd shouted or threatened. "Varsity football player, GPA of 2.3. College prospects dependent entirely on athletic scholarships that require maintaining eligibility through acceptable behavior." She paused, letting that information sink in. "Are you certain that publicly harassing and intimidating other students aligns with the character standards your coaches expect?" Derek's face flushed red, partly from anger and partly from embarrassment at having his academic struggles exposed so casually. "How do you know about my grades? That's private information." "I observe patterns," Aurora replied simply. "Body language, stress responses, overheard conversations, social media posts. People reveal more about themselves than they realize." She turned her attention to Stephanie, who was still holding her phone. Stephanie Morrison, daughter of Morrison Construction Executives, Student Council Treasurer, college applications pending. "I'm curious about how posting videos of yourself participating in harassment campaigns might affect admissions committees at the private universities you're targeting." Stephanie's hand trembled slightly as she lowered her phone. Aurora's casual dismantling of their assumed anonymity was clearly more unsettling than any angry outburst would have been. "And Ashley Rodriguez," Aurora continued, her voice softening slightly as she addressed the girl who'd been most reluctant to participate. "Honor roll student, volunteer at the animal shelter, clearly uncomfortable with what just happened here. I suspect you're wondering how you ended up participating in something that goes against your core values." Ashley's eyes filled with tears, and she took several steps away from Brittany's group, visibly distancing herself from their actions. The public acknowledgement of her discomfort had given her permission to express what she'd been feeling throughout the entire confrontation. Finally, Aurora turned to Brittany, who was still clutching the empty milk cup like a prop she'd forgotten she was holding. "And Brittany Summers, student body vice president, daughter of a prominent local businessman, someone whose family reputation depends on community standing and charitable contributions." Aurora's voice remained calm, but her words carried surgical precision. I wonder how your father would feel about his daughter being recorded while destroying another student's lunch and creating a hostile environment based on dietary choices that many of his potential customers probably share. The color drained from Brittany's face as she realized the implications of what Aurora was suggesting. Her father's car dealerships marketed themselves as family-friendly businesses that supported local schools and community values. Video evidence of his daughter bullying other students could potentially damage those carefully cultivated relationships. "You're bluffing," Brittany said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You don't know anything about my family's business." Aurora smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was something almost predatory in her expression. Summers Automotive Group, established 1987, currently operates 6 dealerships across 3 counties. Your father serves on the school board, sponsors the annual charity golf tournament, and has contributed significant funds to anti-bullying initiatives in local schools. She paused, letting each fact land with its full impact. I believe his most recent public statement emphasized his commitment to creating safe, inclusive environments for all young people. The irony of the situation was now crystal clear to everyone watching. Brittany, whose family publicly championed anti-bullying causes, had just committed an act of clear harassment that was being recorded by multiple phones throughout the cafeteria. "This is insane," Derek muttered, looking around at the circle of students as if seeing them for the first time. "She's just some weird new girl. Why are we even dealing with this?" Aurora turned her attention back to him, and Derek found himself unable to maintain eye contact with her steady gaze. "You're dealing with this, Derek, because you made a choice to participate in harassment instead of using your social influence to prevent it. Leadership isn't just about what you do on the football field." The philosophical weight of her words seemed to land heavily on Derek's shoulders. He glanced around at his teammates who were scattered throughout the cafeteria, many of whom were recording the interaction with expressions that ranged from shock to disappointment. Aurora's casual mention of leadership and character had reframed the entire situation in terms that his coaches and teammates would understand and judge harshly. "Look," Stephanie said, desperation creeping into her voice. "This has gone way too far. It was just a prank. We'll buy you a new lunch or whatever. Can't we just forget this happened?" Aurora looked down at her ruined salad, the carefully arranged vegetables, now swimming in a puddle of milk that had begun to smell sour under the cafeteria's fluorescent lights. "Stephanie, I spent an hour this morning preparing this meal. The ingredients were organic, sustainably sourced, and chosen specifically for their nutritional balance. The presentation represented not just food, but a form of mindful practice that connects me to my values and traditions." She picked up a piece of lettuce that was still recognizable despite being soaked in milk. "This isn't something you can replace by buying me a different lunch from the cafeteria. You've destroyed something that had personal meaning, and you did it deliberately to cause humiliation and distress." The gravity of what they'd done seemed to be settling on Brittany's group for the first time. Their harmless prank was being reframed as an attack on someone's cultural practices, personal beliefs, and carefully prepared expression of identity. Aurora continued, her voice remaining calm but carrying new undertones of authority. "But the destruction of my lunch isn't really the issue here. The issue is that you've revealed something important about yourselves to everyone watching. You've shown that you're the kind of people who derive pleasure from hurting others, who use your social status to target those you perceive as vulnerable, and who mistake cruelty for entertainment." She gestured to the crowd of students who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "Everyone here now knows that when you see someone different, someone who makes choices you don't understand, your instinct is to attack rather than learn. That says nothing about me and everything about who you choose to be." The philosophical framework Aurora was applying to their actions was clearly something Brittany's group hadn't anticipated. They'd expected either submission or retaliation, both of which would have allowed them to maintain their narrative of justified behavior. Instead, they found themselves being analyzed and judged in front of their peers in ways that exposed the essential ugliness of what they'd done. "This is ridiculous," Brittany said, finally finding her voice again. "You're acting like we committed some kind of serious crime. It's just milk on some vegetables. Get over it." Aurora nodded as if she'd expected this response. "You're right. Brittany, in the grand scheme of human suffering, destroying someone's lunch is relatively minor. But character isn't revealed in how people handle major crises. Character is revealed in the small choices we make when we think no one important is watching." She looked around the cafeteria, making eye contact with students at various tables. "Everyone here is watching now. They're seeing how you respond when your actions are challenged, how you justify behavior that targets someone for being different, and whether you take responsibility for the harm you cause or minimize it to avoid consequences." The watching students were indeed paying attention, and their expression suggested that Aurora's analysis was resonating with many of them. Several students who had been previous targets of Brittany's group were nodding in agreement, while others seemed to be reconsidering their own past behavior or complicity in similar situations. Ashley, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Brittany, she's right. This was wrong. We shouldn't have done this." She looked directly at Aurora. "I'm sorry. I knew it was wrong while it was happening, and I should have said something instead of going along with it." Aurora smiled at Ashley, and for the first time since the milk had been poured, her expression showed genuine warmth. "Thank you, Ashley. That took courage, and I appreciate your honesty." The acknowledgement seemed to give Ashley strength to continue. "I don't know why I let myself get pulled into this. You've never done anything to any of us. You just eat your lunch and mind your own business. There was no reason to mess with you." Brittany whirled on Ashley with fury. "Are you seriously taking her side right now? After everything we've done together, you're going to turn on us for some weird girl you don't even know?" "I'm not turning on anyone," Ashley replied, her voice growing stronger. "I'm just saying what we did was wrong, and pretending otherwise doesn't change that." The split in Brittany's group was creating visible tension that everyone in the cafeteria could feel. Derek and Stephanie exchanged uncertain glances, clearly torn between loyalty to their leader and growing awareness that they might have seriously miscalculated the situation. Aurora watched this internal conflict with the detached interest of someone observing a chess match where the outcome was becoming increasingly clear. Her ninja training had included extensive study of group dynamics and psychological pressure points, and she could see exactly how the social structure that had enabled this harassment was beginning to collapse under the weight of public scrutiny. "The interesting thing about groups," Aurora observed, as if she were commenting on a nature documentary rather than the dissolution happening before her, "is that they often enable behavior that individuals would never choose on their own. People do things as part of a group that they would find morally unacceptable if they were acting alone." She looked directly at Stephanie and Derek. "I'm curious about whether either of you would have chosen to pour milk on my lunch if you'd been here by yourselves, without the social pressure to impress Brittany or prove your loyalty to the group." Derek shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet her gaze. Stephanie stared down at her phone, which was still recording everything but now seemed more like evidence of her participation in something shameful rather than a tool for capturing entertainment. "That's a hypothetical question," Stephanie said weakly. "We weren't acting alone, so it doesn't matter, doesn't it?" Aurora asked. "Because now you have to live with the knowledge that you participated in deliberately hurting someone who had never done anything to you. You have to explain to yourselves and to others why you thought that was acceptable behavior. And you have to decide whether this represents who you want to be as people." The weight of these questions seemed to be settling heavily on Derek and Stephanie. They'd clearly expected this to be a brief moment of entertainment at someone else's expense, not a defining moment that would force them to examine their own character and values. Brittany, recognizing that she was losing control of both the situation and her followers, decided to escalate one final time. You know what? You want to play philosophy teacher and act all superior? Let's see how superior you feel when everyone knows exactly what kind of freak you really are. She stepped closer to Aurora, invading her personal space in a way that would have been intimidating to most teenagers. I've been watching you for weeks, and there's something seriously wrong with you. The way you move, the way you watch people, the way you just handled Derek like he was nothing. Normal people don't act like that. Aurora remained perfectly still as Brittany moved closer, but her breathing shifted almost imperceptibly into the time Rhythm Master Yamamoto had taught her for maintaining calm focus under pressure. What exactly are you suggesting, Brittany? I'm suggesting that you're hiding something big, and I'm going to find out what it is. And when I do, everyone in this school is going to know that the weird vegan girl is actually some kind of dangerous psycho who's been pretending to be harmless. The threat hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made several nearby students unconsciously lean forward to hear Aurora's response. Brittany was clearly hoping to provoke an emotional reaction that would validate her accusations and shift public opinion back in her favor. Instead, Aurora smiled with genuine amusement. Brittany, you've just made a very interesting choice. Instead of apologizing for destroying my lunch, taking responsibility for your behavior, or showing any kind of growth from this experience, you've decided to double down by threatening to investigate and expose me. She paused, letting the significance of this decision sink in. That tells everyone watching exactly what kind of person you are when you're challenged. When you face consequences for your actions, your instinct isn't reflection or accountability. It's to attack harder and look for ways to hurt your target more effectively. The accuracy of this analysis was clearly visible on Brittany's face, and the watching students could see how perfectly Aurora had identified and articulated the dynamic that was playing out before them. But here's what's interesting about your threat, Aurora continued. You're assuming that I'm hiding something shameful, something that would damage my reputation if it were revealed. You're projecting your own fears onto me, because you can't imagine living authentically without worrying about how others might judge you. She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. I'm not hiding anything, Brittany. I'm exactly who I appear to be. Someone who makes deliberate choices about how to live, who treats others with respect, and who refuses to be intimidated by people who mistake cruelty for power. The simple dignity of her response seemed to deflate Brittany's anger while simultaneously exposing the essential emptiness of her threats. Aurora had called her bluff while demonstrating a level of self-confidence and authenticity that made Brittany's posturing look petty and desperate by comparison. We'll see about that, Brittany said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was clearly struggling to find a way to salvage her authority and reputation from what had become a very public humiliation. Aurora picked up her milk-soaked lunch container and began gathering the scattered napkins and utensils, her movements calm and purposeful. You're welcome to investigate whatever you'd like, Brittany. But while you're focusing on me, you might want to consider that everyone here now has a very clear understanding of your character and values. That's information that will follow you for the rest of your time at this school. She stood and looked around the cafeteria one final time, making eye contact with various students who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Thank you all for your attention. I hope this has been educational for everyone involved. As Aurora walked toward the exit, carrying her ruined lunch and maintaining perfect composure, despite everything that had happened, the cafeteria slowly began to return to normal activity. But the conversations that resumed were entirely different from those that had been interrupted by the confrontation, and it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the social Dynamics of Lincoln Valley High School, the rest of Aurora's day unfolded in ways that surprised even her highly developed ability to anticipate social patterns. Word of the cafeteria confrontation spread through Lincoln Valley High with the velocity that only teenage gossip could achieve. But unlike typical high school drama, the narrative that emerged painted Aurora not as a victim, but as someone who had fundamentally altered the school's social landscape through sheer force of character. By the time she reached her afternoon chemistry class, Aurora discovered that her lab partner, Marcus Webb, a quiet junior who rarely spoke to anyone, was looking at her with undisguised admiration. Marcus had been present during the cafeteria incident, recording parts of it on his phone like many other students. But unlike most of the casual observers, he seemed to understand the deeper implications of what had occurred. "That was incredible," he said quietly as they began setting up their experiment. "I've never seen anyone handle Brittany's crew like that. The way you just dismantled them without even raising your voice. Where did you learn to do that?" Aurora measured out precise amounts of sodium chloride while considering how to respond. Her ninja training had always emphasized the importance of remaining unremarkable, of blending into whatever environment she found herself in. But the confrontation had already shattered any possibility of maintaining true invisibility at Lincoln Valley High. "I've studied conflict resolution," she said finally, which was technically true even if it didn't capture the full scope of her training. "I've learned that most aggressive behavior stems from insecurity and fear. When you address those underlying emotions directly, the aggression often dissolves." Marcus nodded thoughtfully as he recorded their measurements. "It was like watching a masterclass in psychology. The way you knew all those personal details about them, the way you made them question their own motivations. Are you planning to study psychology in college?" The question touched on something Aurora had been considering more seriously since moving to Lincoln Valley. Her ninja training had given her insights into human behavior that seemed to have applications far beyond martial arts, and she'd been wondering whether she might be able to use those skills in a professional context that focused on helping rather than fighting. "I'm interested in understanding how people interact," she replied, "especially how groups form and how individuals can either contribute to harmful dynamics or help create healthier ones." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Derek Patterson, who slumped into the seat behind them with visible reluctance. Aurora turned to acknowledge him with the same calm attention she'd given him in the cafeteria, showing no sign of holding grudges or expecting continued hostility. Derek fidgeted with his textbook for several minutes before finally speaking. "Look, about what happened at lunch. That wasn't cool. I mean, the whole thing got way out of hand." Aurora waited for him to continue, neither accepting nor rejecting his partial apology. Her training had taught her that people often needed time to work through their thoughts before they could express them clearly, and rushing them rarely led to genuine understanding. "The thing is," Derek continued, "I've been thinking about what you said, about leadership and character and stuff. And I keep wondering what my coaches would think if they saw that video." He paused, clearly struggling with unfamiliar territory. "I guess I never really thought about how the things I do off the field might affect the team." Aurora turned in her seat to face him fully. "What do you think they would say?" Derek's expression grew uncomfortable. "Coach Martinez is always talking about representing the school and the community with integrity. He says that being on the team means being a role model, even when we think nobody's watching." He looked down at his hands. "I definitely wasn't being a role model today." What would being a role model have looked like in that situation? Aurora asked, genuinely curious about his answer. Derek was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with concepts he'd never had to examine before. "I guess ... I could have told Brittany to back off. Or walked away instead of participating. Or maybe even sat with you so you wouldn't have been dealing with them alone." The suggestion surprised Aurora. In all her analysis of potential outcomes, From the cafeteria confrontation, she hadn't considered the possibility that it might lead to someone like Derek reconsidering his entire approach to social dynamics. Those would have been choices that aligned with the leadership principles your coach talks about, Aurora agreed. But they also would have required courage, because they would have meant going against social expectations and risking your status. Within your current group, Derek nodded slowly. Yeah, and that's the part I'm not sure I'm ready for. Like, I know what the right thing is now, but actually doing it when there's pressure from people like Brittany ... That's harder. Aurora appreciated his honesty. Recognizing the difficulty is the first step. Most people convince themselves that they would do the right thing without ever acknowledging how challenging it can be to act against social pressure. Their conversation was overheard by several other students in the chemistry class, and Aurora noticed that similar discussions were happening throughout the room. The cafeteria incident seemed to have prompted many students to reconsider their own behavior and choices, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original confrontation. When the final bell rang, Aurora made her way to her locker, expecting to retrieve her things and head home. Instead, she found a small group of students waiting for her in the hallway. She recognized most of them as people who had been targets of various forms of harassment throughout the school year. Emma Rodriguez, a sophomore who had been mocked for her family's financial struggles. David Kim, a junior who had been bullied for his interest in theater. And Sarah Thompson, a senior who had been targeted for her weight. Aurora, Emma said nervously, we wanted to thank you for what you did today. Not just standing up to Brittany, but the way you did it. You made them look foolish without being cruel about it. David stepped forward, his usual theatrical confidence replaced by genuine emotion. I've been dealing with their harassment since freshman year, and I always thought the only options were to take it or fight back and make things worse. I never considered that you could disarm them psychologically. Sarah nodded in agreement. The way you turned it around and made them examine their own behavior instead of defending yourself was brilliant. I've been trying to figure out how to apply that approach to my own situations. Aurora felt a complex mix of emotions as she listened to their appreciation. Part of her was gratified that her actions had helped others, but another part was concerned about being seen as some kind of expert in handling bullying, when she knew that every situation was unique and required careful consideration. I'm glad the confrontation was helpful, she said carefully. But I want to be clear that what worked in that specific situation might not be appropriate for other circumstances. Every person and every conflict is different. Emma looked disappointed. So you're not going to teach us how to do what you did? Aurora considered the question seriously. Her ninja training included extensive instruction in teaching and mentoring, but it also emphasized the importance of ensuring that students were prepared for the responsibility that came with knowledge. I'd be willing to share some general principles about conflict resolution, she said finally. But it's important to understand that these approaches require practice and careful judgment. They're not techniques you can just apply automatically. David's eyes lit up with excitement. Like a study group? We could meet and discuss different scenarios and how to handle them constructively. The idea had immediate appeal for Aurora. Creating a space where students could develop better tools for handling social conflicts aligned perfectly with the ninja philosophy of using one's abilities to create harmony and prevent unnecessary suffering. That could be valuable, she agreed. But it would need to be approached seriously, with clear guidelines about how the information would be used. The goal would be de-escalation and understanding, not manipulation or revenge. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. We could meet in the library after school. I know Mrs. Patterson would let us use one of the conference rooms if we explained what we were trying to accomplish. As they made plans for their first meeting, Aurora became aware that their conversation was being observed by other students passing through the hallway. Some seemed curious about what they were discussing, while others appeared skeptical or even hostile. She realized that her actions in the cafeteria had not only changed her own social position, but had also aligned her with students who were outside the mainstream social hierarchy. The implications of this alignment became clearer when she encountered Stephanie Morrison near the main entrance. Stephanie was standing with two girls Aurora didn't recognize, but their body language suggested they were discussing the day's events and Aurora's role in them. "Well, if it isn't the school's new social justice warrior," Stephanie called out, loudly enough to attract attention from nearby students. "I hear you're starting some kind of anti-bullying club. How noble of you." Aurora paused, recognizing that this encounter was likely being orchestrated to test her response to continued provocation. Stephanie was clearly hoping to regain some social standing by demonstrating that she wasn't intimidated by Aurora's earlier display of psychological sophistication. "I'm not starting an anti-bullying club," Aurora replied calmly. "I'm interested in helping people develop better communication and conflict resolution skills. Those are valuable abilities regardless of the specific situations where they're applied." One of Stephanie's companions, a tall girl with perfectly straightened hair and expensive jewelry, stepped forward with obvious skepticism. "Communication skills? Is that what you call humiliating people in front of the entire cafeteria?" Aurora turned her attention to the new speaker, automatically cataloging details about her posture, vocal patterns, and social positioning. "I didn't humiliate anyone. I simply responded to their actions and stated observations about their behavior. Any humiliation they experienced came from recognition of the disconnect between their actions and their stated values." The distinction seemed to confuse the girl, who had clearly expected a simpler dynamic of attack and counterattack. "That's just fancy words for making people look bad." "Actually," Aurora said, "it's the difference between attacking someone's character and helping them see how their actions might not align with who they want to be. One approach creates enemies, while the other creates opportunities for growth." Stephanie laughed, but it sounded forced. "Growth? You think Brittany is going to grow from being embarrassed in front of the whole school?" Aurora considered the question seriously. "I think Brittany has an opportunity to examine whether her current approach to social relationships is actually serving her well. Whether she takes advantage of that opportunity is entirely up to her." The philosophical framework Aurora continued to apply to these interactions was clearly frustrating Stephanie, who seemed to want a more straightforward conflict that would allow her to position herself as either victim or victor. Instead, she found herself being drawn into discussions about personal development and ethical behavior. "You're really weird, you know that?" the tall girl said, apparently deciding that direct insults might be more effective than attempting to engage with Aurora's arguments. "I've been told that," Aurora acknowledged without defensiveness. "I think it usually means that my approach to situations is different from what people expect. I'm comfortable with being different if it means acting according to my principles." The simple acceptance of the criticism while reframing it in terms of personal integrity left both girls without an obvious follow-up. They'd clearly hoped to provoke defensiveness or anger, either of which would have given them emotional ammunition to use against Aurora. Stephanie tried a different approach. "Look, I don't know what your game is here, but you need to understand something about how this school works. There are social rules, and when you mess with them, there are consequences." Aurora nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right that there are social rules, and that breaking them can have consequences. But you seem to be assuming that those rules are fixed and beneficial. What if some of them actually create unnecessary suffering and prevent people from reaching their potential?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither Stephanie nor her companion seemed prepared to address. Aurora had once again shifted the conversation from personal attack to broader philosophical examination, making it difficult for them to maintain their hostile stance without appearing shallow or thoughtless. "Whatever," Stephanie said finally. "Just remember that you're still new here, and new people who cause too much trouble don't usually last very long." The threat was vague but unmistakable, and Aurora could sense that other students in the area had heard it and were waiting to see how she would respond. This was clearly another test, designed to see whether she could be intimidated through warnings about future consequences. "Stephanie," Aurora said, her voice remaining calm but carrying new undertones of authority, "I want to make sure I understand what you're suggesting. Are you saying that students who challenge harmful social dynamics should expect to face retaliation? Because that sounds like you're describing a system based on fear rather than mutual respect." The directness of her interpretation seemed to catch Stephanie off guard. She'd clearly intended her threat to be subtle enough to deny if challenged, but Aurora had stated its implications so clearly that denial would look foolish. "I'm just saying that actions have consequences," Stephanie replied weakly. "They certainly do," Aurora agreed. "And I think everyone who witnessed today's events learned something important about the consequences of choosing cruelty over kindness, intimidation over respect, and group dynamics that enable harm rather than growth." She looked around at the students who had gathered to watch this exchange, making brief eye contact with several of them. "The question each person has to answer for themselves is what kind of consequences they want to create through their choices, and what kind of school community they want to be part of building." With that observation, Aurora walked away, leaving Stephanie and her companion to deal with the attention of students who had overheard the entire exchange. As she headed toward the parking lot where her mother would be picking her up, Aurora reflected on how dramatically her situation at Lincoln Valley High had changed in the span of a single lunch period. The anonymity she'd carefully maintained for 3 weeks was completely gone, replaced by a visibility that brought both opportunities and risks. Students who had never acknowledged her existence were now seeking her out for advice and support, while others were clearly preparing to test whether her psychological techniques could withstand sustained social pressure. But perhaps most significantly, Aurora realized that her ninja training had prepared her for exactly this type of complex social battlefield. The principles Master Yamamoto had taught her about reading opponents, maintaining mental balance under pressure, and using minimal force to achieve maximum effect were proving to be incredibly valuable in navigating the intricate dynamics of teenage social hierarchies. As her mother's car pulled up to the curb, Aurora made a mental note to call Master Yamamoto that evening. She had questions about how to balance her desire to help others with the ninja principle of remaining inconspicuous, and she suspected that the challenges she'd face at Lincoln Valley High were only just beginning, 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident that had transformed the social landscape of Lincoln Valley High School. Aurora Chun found herself in a position she had never anticipated. Reluctant leader of a movement that was reshaping how students interacted with each other across the entire campus. The study group she had agreed to facilitate had grown from 4 founding members to over 30 students who met twice weekly in the school library. What had begun as informal discussions about conflict resolution had evolved into something approaching a peer counseling program, with students bringing real problems and working together to develop constructive solutions. Aurora sat in her usual spot at the head of the large conference table, watching as Emma Rodriguez practiced a role-playing scenario with David Kim. Emma was preparing to confront a group of seniors who had been making comments about her family's financial situation, and she wanted to test different approaches before the actual conversation. "Remember," Aurora coached gently, "the goal isn't to prove them wrong or make them feel bad about their assumptions. The goal is to create a space where genuine understanding becomes possible." Emma nodded, taking a deep breath before beginning. "Again, I understand that you might not realize how your comments about people who shop at thrift stores affect students whose families are dealing with financial challenges. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to consider how those remarks might impact your classmates. David, playing the role of one of the seniors, responded with the kind of defensive hostility Emma was likely to encounter. Are you saying we can't have opinions about how people dress? It's a free country. Aurora observed Emma's body language. As she processed this response, noting the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated rising defensiveness. Pause for a moment, Emma. Notice what you're feeling right now, and consider whether that emotional state is going to help you achieve your goal. Emma closed her eyes briefly, using the breathing techniques Aurora had taught the group. When she opened them again, her posture had relaxed and her expression showed calm determination rather than defensive anger. I'm not trying to control your opinions, Emma said to David. I'm asking whether you've considered that some of your classmates might be making the best choices they can with limited resources, and that comments about their clothing might make them feel excluded from their own school community. The reframing was masterful, and Aurora could see that the other students watching the exercise understood the difference between Emma's first and second approaches. By focusing on impact rather than intent, Emma had created space for dialogue rather than defensive argument. Excellent, Aurora said as the role play concluded. You've demonstrated how shifting the framework of a conversation can change its entire trajectory. Instead of attacking the person's character or demanding that they change their opinions, you've invited them to consider information they might not have and to make their own decisions about how to respond. Sarah Thompson raised her hand from across the table. But what if they just refuse to consider it? What if they double down and get more cruel? Aurora had anticipated this question, as it came up in almost every session. Students who had been targets of harassment often struggled to believe that psychological approaches could work with truly committed bullies. That's when you have to decide whether continued engagement serves any purpose, Aurora replied. Some people aren't ready to examine their behavior, and trying to force that examination often makes situations worse. The goal is to create opportunities for growth, not to guarantee that everyone will take advantage of those opportunities. Marcus Webb, who had become one of the most dedicated members of the group, leaned forward with interest. So how do you decide when to walk away versus when to keep trying? Aurora considered the question carefully. It touched on some of the most advanced aspects of her ninja training, concepts that Master Yamamoto had emphasized required years of practice to apply effectively. I think about whether the other person is showing any genuine curiosity about their own motivations, she said finally. If someone is asking real questions, even if they're defensive about it, there might be potential for growth. But if they're just looking for ways to justify their behavior or shift blame to others, continued engagement usually isn't productive. The discussion was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway outside the conference room. Through the glass walls, Aurora could see a crowd of students gathering around what appeared to be a heated argument. Several members of her group stood up to get a better view, and Aurora could hear raised voices even through the closed door. Should we do something? David asked, looking to Aurora for guidance. Aurora moved to the window and quickly assessed the situation. In the center of the crowd, she could see Brittany Summers engaged in what appeared to be a confrontation with Tyler Morrison, a sophomore who had recently started attending their conflict resolution sessions. Tyler was clearly upset, his face flushed and his hands shaking, while Brittany seemed to be enjoying his distress. Emma, Sarah, please stay here with the other students, Aurora said calmly. Marcus and David, come with me. Let's see if we can help de-escalate whatever's happening. As they approached the crowd, Aurora could hear Brittany's voice cutting through the noise. Think you can hide behind your little therapy group forever. Tyler, this is the real world, and in the real world, pathetic losers like you don't get to pretend they matter. Tyler was visibly struggling to apply the techniques he'd learned in their sessions, but the public nature of the confrontation and Brittany's skillful psychological pressure were clearly overwhelming his ability to remain calm and centered. "Brittany," Aurora said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowd as she stepped into the circle that had formed around the two students. "I see you're having a conversation with Tyler. Is this something that needs to be resolved publicly? Or would you prefer to handle it privately?" Brittany turned toward Aurora with undisguised hostility. Over the past 3 weeks, she had watched her social influence steadily erode as more students began questioning the dynamic she had worked years to establish. Aurora's growing popularity and the visible success of her conflict resolution group represented everything Brittany felt threatened by. "Well, well," Brittany said loudly, ensuring that her words would carry to every student in the gathered crowd. "Here comes the school's self-appointed guru, ready to solve everyone's problems with her magical wisdom." She gestured mockingly at Aurora. "Tell me, oh wise one, how exactly do you plan to fix the fact that Tyler here is a pathetic loser who can't handle basic social interaction?" Aurora could sense the anticipation in the crowd. Many students had heard about her previous confrontations with Brittany's group, but this was the first time they'd witnessed a direct challenge since the cafeteria incident. Some were clearly hoping for drama, while others seemed genuinely curious about how Aurora would handle this very public test. "I'm not here to fix anyone," Aurora replied calmly, positioning herself so that she could see both Brittany and Tyler while maintaining awareness of the crowd around them. "People aren't broken things that need repair. They're complex individuals dealing with their own challenges and trying to figure out how to navigate difficult situations." She turned slightly toward Tyler, whose breathing was rapid and shallow. "Tyler, you look like you're feeling overwhelmed right now. Would it be helpful to take a moment to center yourself before continuing this conversation?" Tyler nodded gratefully, closing his eyes and using the breathing techniques Aurora had taught. The simple act of being given permission to pause and collect himself seemed to immediately reduce his visible distress. Brittany watched this interaction with growing frustration. She had clearly hoped to provoke Tyler into an emotional breakdown that would demonstrate the ineffectiveness of Aurora's methods. Instead, she was witnessing exactly the kind of practical application that made those methods appealing to other students. "Oh, this is precious," Brittany said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are we all going to stand here while Tyler does his little meditation routine? Because I have better things to do than watch this pathetic display." Aurora turned her full attention to Brittany, and something in her gaze made several students in the crowd unconsciously step backward. For the first time since the confrontation began, Aurora allowed some of the intensity from her ninja training to show through her carefully maintained composure. "Brittany," Aurora said, her voice remaining calm but carrying new undertones of authority, "I'm curious about what you're hoping to accomplish here. You've chosen to publicly confront someone who's been working to develop better communication skills. You've attempted to humiliate him in front of his peers, and you've dismissed any attempt at constructive resolution." She paused, letting her observations sink in. "What outcome are you trying to achieve?" The directness of the question seemed to catch Brittany off guard. She'd been focused on attacking Tyler and challenging Aurora's methods, but she hadn't prepared for being asked to articulate her actual goals. "I'm trying to show everyone that your little feel-good philosophy doesn't work in the real world," Brittany replied, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Aurora nodded thoughtfully. "So your goal is to demonstrate that compassionate approaches to conflict resolution are ineffective. And your method for proving this is to create a hostile situation where you attack someone who's trying to apply those approaches constructively." She looked around the crowd, making brief eye contact with various students. "Does anyone else see the logical problem with this test?" Several students began to murmur as they recognized what Aurora was pointing out. Marcus stepped forward slightly, his voice carrying the entire crowd. "You can't prove that peaceful methods don't work by refusing to engage with them peacefully. That's like saying medicine doesn't work while preventing someone from taking it. The observation sparked additional comments from other students, and Aurora could see that Brittany was losing control of the narrative she'd hoped to create. Instead of demonstrating the failure of Aurora's approaches, she was inadvertently highlighting their effectiveness by contrast with her own behavior. "This is ridiculous," Brittany said, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. "You people are all living in some fantasy world where everyone just talks through their problems and everything works out perfectly. But that's not how life actually works." Aurora studied Brittany's expression, noting the genuine frustration and fear underlying her anger. For the first time since their initial confrontation, Aurora could see past Brittany's aggressive facade to the insecurity and confusion that was driving her behavior. "You're right that life doesn't always work out perfectly," Aurora said, her voice softening slightly. "And you're right that not every conflict can be resolved through communication and understanding. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try those approaches first, before resorting to methods that create more harm." She took a step closer to Brittany, her movement calm and non-threatening. "I'm wondering if you've considered that the approaches you've been using might not be serving you as well as you'd hoped. You seem frustrated and angry much of the time. Your friendships appear to be based on fear rather than genuine connection, and you're investing enormous energy in maintaining a social position that requires you to constantly attack others." The psychological assessment was delivered with clinical precision, but Aurora's tone remained compassionate rather than judgmental. She was offering Brittany an opportunity for self-reflection rather than attacking her character. "You don't know anything about my life," Brittany replied, but her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. "You're absolutely right," Aurora acknowledged. "I only see what you choose to show in public, and that might not reflect your complete experience. But what I observe is someone who seems to be carrying a lot of pain and expressing it through behaviors that isolate her from the kind of genuine connections that might actually help." The insight seemed to hit Brittany like a physical blow. For a moment, her aggressive mask slipped completely, revealing vulnerability and confusion that surprised even her usual allies. Several students in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing aspects of their own behavior in Aurora's description. Brittany began, then stopped, seemingly unable to formulate a response to Aurora's unexpected compassion. Aurora waited patiently, giving Brittany space to process what she was feeling without pressure to respond immediately. The crowd around them had grown quieter, sensing that something significant was happening beyond the typical dynamics of high school confrontation. "I don't know how to do it differently," Brittany said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been handling things this way for so long that I don't know what else to do when people challenge me or when I feel threatened." Admission sent ripples of shock through the watching students. Brittany Summers, who had terrorized countless classmates and ruled the school's social hierarchy through fear and intimidation, was publicly acknowledging that her methods weren't working and that she needed help. Aurora felt a complex mix of satisfaction and compassion as she recognized the breakthrough moment she'd been working toward since their first confrontation. Brittany hadn't just been defeated. She'd been offered a path toward growth and had chosen to take the first step down it. "Learning different approaches takes time and practice," Aurora said gently, "and it requires being willing to feel vulnerable while you're developing new skills. But the students in our group have found that the effort is worth it, because the relationships they build using these methods are much more satisfying than ones based on power and control." She looked around the crowd, then back at Brittany. "You'd be welcome to join our sessions if you're interested in exploring alternatives. There's no judgment about past behavior. Everyone starts from wherever they are and works on developing better tools." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that extended far beyond the immediate confrontation. Brittany looked around at the faces surrounding her, many of which belonged to students she had hurt or intimidated over the years. Some showed skepticism about her potential for change, but others reflected curiosity and even hope. Brittany began again, then took a deep breath. I think I'd like that. I mean, if the group would be okay with me joining. Tyler, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, stepped forward unexpectedly. I think it would be good for everyone if you joined, he said quietly. Especially if you're really serious about learning different ways to handle conflicts. The gesture of forgiveness from someone she had just been attacking seemed to complete Brittany's transformation. Tears began running down her cheeks as she fully grasped the magnitude of what she'd been doing to others, and what she'd been missing in her own life. Aurora moved closer and placed a gentle hand on Brittany's shoulder. Growth is always possible, she said quietly. The hardest part is usually admitting that change is necessary. You've already taken that step. As the crowd began to disperse, Aurora found herself reflecting on how completely the dynamics at Lincoln Valley High School had shifted over the past month. What had begun as a simple confrontation over a ruined lunch had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how students related to each other. The conflict resolution group continued to grow, with new members joining every week as word spread about its effectiveness. Students who had once been bitter enemies were learning to address their differences constructively. Teachers reported dramatic improvements in classroom behavior and academic performance as students spent less energy on social warfare and more unlearning. Most importantly, Aurora had discovered that her ninja training had applications she'd never imagined. The principles Master Yamamoto had taught her about balance, awareness, and minimal effective force proved to be incredibly valuable. Tools for creating positive change in complex social systems. As she walked home that afternoon, Aurora realized that she'd found her calling. Whether she pursued formal study in psychology, conflict resolution, or education, she wanted to continue helping people develop better ways of relating to each other. The skills she'd learned in the dojo could be used to create harmony and prevent suffering on a much larger scale than she'd ever thought possible. The quiet girl, who had just wanted to eat her lunch in peace, had accidentally become a catalyst for transformation, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression isn't fighting back, it's showing others a better way forward. At Lincoln Valley High School, Aurora Chun had done more than defend herself against bullies. She'd created a new culture based on understanding, growth, and genuine respect. The ninja principles of remaining invisible while creating maximum positive impact had been perfectly fulfilled, even though Aurora's methods had made her anything but invisible. She'd learned that true invisibility sometimes meant being seen clearly for who you really were, and that the greatest victories were those where everyone involved became stronger and wiser than they'd been before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.